The Riel Rebellion, 1869 to 1870. The Red River Rebellion. The first Riel Rebellion, also known as the Red River Rebellion, Red River Resistance, and Red River Rising, was the sequence of events that led up to the establishment of a provisional government by Métis leader Louis Riel and his followers at the Red River Colony. This was in the early stages of establishing today's Canadian province of Manitoba. It had earlier been a territory called Rupert's Land, and being under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company before it was sold. The event was the first crisis of the new federal government faced after Canadian Confederation in 1867. The Government of Canada had bought Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1869 and appointed an English-speaking governor, William McDougall. He was opposed by the French-speaking, mostly Métis inhabitants of the settlement. Before the land was officially transferred to Canada, McDougall had sent out surveyors to plot the land, according to the square township system used in the Dominion Land Survey. The Métis, led by Riel, prevented McDougall from entering the territory. McDougall declared that the Hudson's Bay Company was no longer in control of the territory, and that Canada had asked for the transfer of sovereignty to be postponed. The Métis created a provisional government to which they invited an equal number of Anglophone representatives. Riel negotiated directly with the Canadian government to establish Manitoba as a Canadian province. Meanwhile, Riel's men arrested members of a pro-Canadian faction who resisted the provincial government. The arrested included an Orangeman, Thomas Scott. Riel tried Scott for insubordination, convicted him, and then executed him. Canada and the Assiniboia Provisional Government soon negotiated an agreement. In 1870, the Parliament of Canada passed the Manitoba Act 1870, allowing the Red River Colony to enter Confederation as the Province of Manitoba. The Act also incorporated some of Riel's demands, such as the provision of separate French schools for Métis children and the protection of Catholicism. After reaching an agreement, Canada sent a military expedition to Manitoba to enforce federal authority. Now known as the Wolseley Expedition, or the Red River Expedition, it consisted of Canadian militia and British regular soldiers, led by Colonel Garnet Wolseley. Outrage grew in Ontario over Scott's execution, and many wanted Wolseley's expedition to arrest Riel for murder and to suppress what they considered to be a rebellion. Riel peacefully withdrew from Fort Henry before the troops could arrive in August 1870. Warned by many that the soldiers would harm him and denied amnesty for his political leadership of the rebellion, Riel fled to the United States. The arrival of troops marked the end of the rebellion. In 1885, Louis Riel would lead another rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion, ending with his capture and execution. Background. To understand the events of the Riel Rebellion more completely, the history of Upper Fort Garry and Lower Fort Garry must first be thoroughly explained. Fort Garry. Fort Garry, also known as Upper Fort Garry, was a Hudson's Bay Company trading post located at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, in or near the area now known as the Forks, in what is now central Winnipeg, Manitoba. Fort Garry was established in 1822, although its first buildings were destroyed in 1826 by severe flooding. The trading post was rebuilt in 1836 and served as the administrative center of the Red River Colony. From 1869 to 1870, the fort was briefly occupied by Louis Riel and his Métis followers during the Red River Rebellion. The fort was demolished in the 1880s to make way for Winnipeg's Main Street, although the fort's gate still remains. The site of the former fort was designated as part of a larger National Historic Site in 1924. Development of a provincial heritage site on the historic site of Fort Garry began in the early 21st century. History. Fort Garry was established by the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, in 1822, on or near the site of the Northwest Company's Fort Gibraltar, established by John Wills in 1810, and destroyed by Governor Semple's men in 1816 during the Pemmican War. Fort Garry was named after Nicholas Garry, deputy governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. It served as the center of the fur trade within the Red River Colony. In 1826, a severe flood destroyed the fort. The fort was rebuilt in 1836 by HBC to help facilitate the administrative and supply needs for the Red River Colony. The new fort was named Upper Fort Garry to differentiate it from the Lower Fort, or Lower Fort Garry, 32 kilometers downriver, which was established in 1831. Throughout the mid to late 19th century, Upper Fort Garry played a minor role in the actual trading of furs, but was central to the administration of the HBC and surrounding settlement. The Council of Assiniboia, the administrative and judicial body of the Red River Colony, mainly run by Hudson's Bay Company officials, met in Upper Fort Garry. This image is of inside Fort Garry in 1884. The fort was demolished during that decade. In 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company agreed to surrender its monopoly in the Northwest, including Upper Fort Garry. In late 1869 and early 1870, the fort was seized by Louis Riel and his Métis followers during the Red River Rebellion. After the rebellion, the area around the fort continued to grow. In 1873, the city of Winnipeg was established, and the name Fort Garry was no longer used. In 1881 to 1884, the majority of the fort was demolished to straighten out Main Street. It was at Main Street and Assiniboine Avenue. Legacy. Fort Garry, along with the sites of nearby Fort Rouge and Fort Gibraltar, were collectively designated as a National Historic Site in 1924 under the name Forts Rouge, Garry, and Gibraltar National Historic Site. Together, the three sites show the evolution of the fur trade in Western Canada. From exploration and expansion westward, Fort Rouge was established in 1738 by the French. Then was the dominance of the Northwest Company, with Fort Gibraltar being established in 1807. Finally, the area was taken over by the Hudson's Bay Company and the establishment of Fort Garry. The gate at Fort Garry is the only above-ground remains of the succession efforts that's original. On June 15th, 1938, Canada Post issued Fort Garry Gate, Winnipeg, which was a 20-cent stamp. Although only the fort's main gate remains today, the name Fort Garry lives on through various institutions and businesses. An area or division of Winnipeg running along the Red River south of the original fort is called Fort Garry. The hotel beside the fort is called the Fort Garry Hotel, which was originally constructed for the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway Company. Fort Street and Garry Street are on either side of the hotel. Many companies, such as Fort Garry Industries and the Fort Garry Brewing Company, have adopted the name. The Fort Garry Horse has been a component of the Winnipeg military garrison throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries. Provincial Heritage Park. Work has begun on a project to establish a heritage park in the area surrounding what remains of Upper Fort Garry. In the spring of 2010, a bill passed the House in the Manitoba legislature entitled the Upper Fort Garry Heritage Provincial Park Act. Here is the Stone Gate Tower, which is the last standing structure from Fort Garry. It is now used as the Upper Fort Garry Provincial Park Gate entrance. In 2007, a developing company, Crystal Developers, tried to build an apartment complex next to the fort's original footprint. However, the Friends of Upper Fort Garry, a group dedicated to developing a historical interpretive park at the site, was convened to oppose them. The plan called for an interpretive center just outside the old fort's walls and a large surface parking lot that would have been placed closer to the walls than the apartment itself. After a City of Winnipeg imposed deadline to raise funds to build a park on the site was nearing, Crystal Developers decided to grant the Friends an additional 2 years to finish raising the needed funds. Crystal ultimately bowed out of its proposed development plans. 2 years later, the City of Winnipeg approved the construction by Crystal Developers of a 25-story apartment tower just west of the original location on Assiniboine Avenue. The Friends raised enough funds to purchase the buildings already on the site of their proposed heritage park, including a Petro-Canada gas station. The only building that was allowed to stay untouched was the current home of the Manitoba Club, which started as an organization in 1874, only 1 year after the incorporation of Winnipeg. The existing Manitoba Club building was completed in 1905. The historic Fort Garry Hotel across the street was built shortly after that, in 1913. The park opened on August 6, 2015, with further development still to come. Lower Fort Garry. Lower Fort Garry was built in 1830 by the Hudson's Bay Company on the western bank of the Red River, 32 kilometers north of the original Fort Garry. Treaty 1 was signed here. When a devastating flood destroyed Fort Garry in 1826, the company's then governor, George Simpson, searched for a safer location down the river. Governor Simpson chose the site of Lower Fort Garry because of its high ground and location below the St. Andrews Rapids, eliminating a time-consuming portage of heavy fur packs and York boats. However, the fort never became the administrative center it was intended to be, since most of the population of the area was centered near the forks and objected to the extra travel required to do business at the new fort. As a result, Upper Fort Garry was rebuilt in stone at the forks, very near the original Fort Garry site. History. Early 19th century, 1830 to 1850. The first buildings built at the fort in 1830 were the Fur Loft, which housed the company's store, small warehouse and trader's office, and the Big House, which was the residence for the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, and other high-ranking officials. Later additions included a warehouse and a men's house. The fort's signature walls were completed in the 1840s, adding an ice house, powder magazine, bakehouse, and warehouse bastions. These walls were non-military, intended only to make the fort appear more important and impressive to both local traders and visiting HBC officers. The lower fort did trade a small amount of furs, but its main purposes was as a supply depot for the Red River settlement and the surrounding Cree, Anishinaabe, Métis, and European populations. The Europeans were mostly Scots from the Orkney Islands. Many furs at the fort were brought from other districts, repackaged at the fort, and sent to England through the York factory. The post traded manufactured goods to the farmers and hunters for produce that was then used for provisioning company treks to the north. Here is an image of the walls of Lower Fort Garry, which were completed in 1848. Every now and then, there was a crisis that called for military action, and Lower Fort Garry was the obvious choice for a base of operations. In 1846, British troops of the 6th Regiment of Foot were sent to the fort. They were the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. When a dispute erupted with the United States over the boundary between the Oregon Territory and what is now British Columbia. However, some believe the request for troops was actually intended to intimidate local free traders. Trading with anyone other than the HBC was illegal. In either case, by the time the troops arrived in 1846, the threat of invasion was long over. The troops became a nuisance by causing minor disturbances, so they were put to work at the fort completing the construction of the walls, which were finished in 1848. mid-19th century, 1851 to 1884. The fort became an industrial center by the 1860s and included several buildings, such as a flour mill, sawmill, forge, and a brewery. When the Red River Rebellion broke out in 1870, Louis Riel occupied Upper Fort Garry, and the Quebec Rifles took the Lower Fort. Their traces are part of the Royal Rifles of Canada and Les Voltigeurs de Québec. No wars or fights ever occurred at Lower Fort Garry, as it was a peaceful settlement. On August 3rd, 1871, the first treaty in Western Canada was established between the federal government and 7 chiefs of the Ojibwe and Swampy Cree First Nations at Lower Fort Garry. Indian Treaty Number 1. Transferred the land that now comprises part of modern Manitoba. The treaty's intent was to ensure the peaceful settlement of the prairies by European immigrants, while providing First Nations people with land, access to resources, and other necessities for their survival. Almost immediately after the treaty was established, the two parties disagreed on its meaning. Indian Treaty Number 1, the precedent for the 10 subsequent numbered treaties in Western Canada, is commemorated by Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada plaque outside the Visitor Reception Centre. Training of the Northwest Mounted Police members took place in the fort in the winter of 1873 to 1874. Many of the Northwest Mounted Police of 1873-1874 had been there already during the rebellion in 1870. They included Inspector James F. McLeod, who had met his fiancée, Mary Drever, at Lower Fort Garry on the previous trip. The first contingent of Mounties arrived in Lower Fort Garry in October 22nd, 1873, and on November 3rd, they were sworn in and commenced training. The bitter winter was spent drilling and learning to ride. The parade ground was frozen as hard as concrete and was pretty unforgiving when a recruit was unexpectedly pitched from his horse. By the following June, they were caught up in preparations for the arrival of Commissioner G.A. French and the other divisions, and headed out to meet them at Fort Dufferin. The fort was turned over once again to the Canadian militia. Recent history, 1885 to present. Here is an image of a reenactor working at the fort. Between May and September, the fort is used as a living museum, with reenactors recreating life in the 1850s. The fort has also been a penitentiary, a mental hospital from 1885 to 1886, an HBC residence, and a golf course and motor country club from 1911 to 1963. One of the mental hospital's most infamous residents was Honore Jackson, Louis Riel's secretary, who was found not guilty by reason of insanity after the Northwest Rebellion. The Historic Sites and Monuments Board installed a plaque to commemorate the fort's status as a historic site in 1929. The HBC owned the fort until 1951, when it was given to the federal government. The site was designated a National Historic Site in 1958. Background to the Riel Rebellion. In the late 1860s, the Red River colony of Rupert's Land was changing rapidly. It had developed under the aegis of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, which had a continent-wide trading and commercial network. It had been confirmed on the territory by Queen Anne, who had evicted King Louis XIV and his subjects from it by the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. Further notice was given in 1763 when King George III dispossessed King Louis XV of nearly all his colonies in North America at the Treaty of Paris. Historically, the population was mainly Francophone Métis, who developed a mixed ethnicity descended of First Nations and French descent, and a unique culture during the decades of the fur trade. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they intermarried, established a tradition of men working as trappers, guides, and interpreters to fur traders, and developed farms. Métis women also were sometimes active in the trade, and among several influential families in Sault Ste. Marie in the early 19th century, the husbands were European. The Métis culture was based on the French language and Roman Catholic religion. In the late 18th century, English and Scottish men entered the fur trade and also married into the Ojibwe people and other First Nations in this region. Their mixed-race descendants generally spoke English and were sometimes known as the country-born, and also the Anglo-Métis. The third group of settlers to the region was a small number of Presbyterian Scottish settlers. More Anglophone Protestants began to settle there from Ontario in the 19th century. The newer settlers were generally insensitive to Métis culture and hostile to Roman Catholicism, and many advocated Canadian expansionism. Meanwhile, many Americans migrated there, some of whom favoring annexation of the territory by the United States. Against the backdrop of religious, nationalistic, and ethnic tensions, political uncertainty was high. To forestall U.S. expansionism and to bring law and order to the wild, the British and Canadian governments had been for some time negotiating the transfer of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada. The British Rupert's Land Act, 1868, authorized the transfer. On December 1st, 1869, Canada purchased the territory. In anticipation of the transfer, Public Works Minister William McDougall, who, with George Etienne Cartier, had been instrumental in securing Rupert's Land for Canada, ordered a survey party to the Red River colony. A Catholic bishop, Alexander Antoine Taché, the Anglican bishop of Rupert's Land, Robert McCrae, and the HBC governor of Assiniboia, William McTavish, all warned the federal government that such surveys would precipitate unrest. Headed by Colonel John Stoughton Dennis, the survey party arrived at Fort Garry on August 20th, 1869. The Métis were anxious about the survey since they did not possess clear title to their lands but held tenuous right of occupancy. In addition, the lots had been laid out according to the French seigneurial colonial system with long, narrow lots fronting the river, rather than the square lots that were preferred by the English. The Métis considered the survey to be a forerunner of increased Canadian migration to the territory, which they perceived as a threat to their way of life. More specifically, they feared a possible confiscation of their farmland by the Canadian government. The Métis were also concerned that Canadian immigrants would not care for their culture, and so the Métis wanted to ensure that they could preserve their religious and political rights. Their concerns were motivated in part by the Canadian government's behavior, as the negotiations that took place had been carried out as if the territory was uninhabited. Emergence of Riel as leader. The Canadian government appointed William McDougall as the designate of the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories on September 28, 1869, in anticipation of a formal transfer to take effect on December 1st. Some sources smear McDougall as a notorious Francophobe in order to twist the narrative against the Canadian government at the time. The gossip about the increased tensions among the Métis, who, in July 1869, had become more suspicious after McDougall ordered a survey of the settlement. This was obviously a misinformation program to make the simple survey into something that it wasn't, and create a sinister aspect without real negative intent. It was simply a logical proceeding for mapping the new territory for Canada. Emerging as a leader, Louis Riel, who had been formally educated in European-style schools, denounced the survey in a speech delivered in late August from the steps of St. Boniface Cathedral. He was making an effort to stir up support for his rise to power and chance to become a president of his own country, regardless of the truth of the matter or the cost in lives of others. His lifestyle was very different from those of the buffalo hunting Métis. When Riel returned to the West, it was apparent that Prime Minister MacDonald feared that the United States was negotiating with HBC for the transfer of Rupert's Land without consulting the Red River population and the Council of Assiniboia. On October 11th, 1869, Riel and other Métis disrupted the survey's work. On October 16th, the group organized the Métis National Committee to represent Métis interests. Riel was elected secretary, John Bruce as president, and 2 representatives were elected from each parish. This was not a step towards the growth and establishment of Canada. This was rebellion. There were originally 2 resistance groups, better described as rebel groups, in Red River. One was led by Riel, and the other was led by a Métis named William Dease, who expressed Métis values in his opposition. For a long time, they were locked in a power struggle on a symbolic level, both sides offering different perspectives on Métis unity. Riel finally defeated Dease for the leadership of the resistance, or rebellion, and consolidated his support system within the French Métis community. He then felt strong enough to initiate the breach of October 1869. as the territory was officially part of Canada at this time, he was committing treason. Because the Hudson's Bay Company Council of Assiniboia still had authority over the area, its representatives summoned Riel on October 25th to explain the actions of the committee. On October 30th, McDougall had reached the border despite the written order from Riel, who declared that any attempt by McDougall to enter the Red River Colony would be blocked unless the Canadians had first negotiated terms with the Métis and with the general population of the government. On November 2nd, under the command of Ambroise Daidime Lepine, the Métis turned back McDougall's party near the U.S. border and forced it to retreat to Pembina, Dakota Territory. On the same day, Riel led roughly 400 men recruited from the fur brigades recently returned to the settlement for the season to seize Fort Garry without bloodshed. That would come to be known as one of Riel's most brilliant moves, as control of the fort symbolized control of all access to the settlement and the Northwest. To those who are less biased in favor of Riel, this was the beginning of open war with the legal government of Canada. Residents of the Red River Colony disagreed on how to negotiate with Canada. In particular, the French and English-speaking inhabitants did not agree on how to proceed. In a conciliatory gesture, Riel, on November 6th, asked the Anglophones to select delegates from each of their parishes to attend a convention with the Métis representatives. After little was accomplished at the first meeting, James Ross expressed displeasure at Riel's treatment of McDougall. Riel angrily denied that and stated that he had no intentions of invoking American interventions. Instead, throughout the entire resistance, more correctly, rebellion, he insisted that he and the Métis were loyal subjects of Queen Victoria. His rebellion against the British and Canadian governments proved otherwise. On November 16th, the Council of Assiniboia made a final attempt to assert its authority, when Governor MacTavish issued a proclamation ordering the Métis to lay down their arms. Instead, on November 23rd, Riel proposed the formation of a provisional government to replace the Council of Assiniboia, to enter into direct negotiations with Canada. The Anglophone delegates requested an adjournment to discuss matters. They neither succeeded in rallying the English-speaking parishes behind that move, nor originally approved of the list of rights which was presented to the convention on December 1st. Despite his Métis sympathies, Governor MacTavish did not do enough to end the conflict and was imprisoned by Riel shortly afterward. Also on December 1st, McDougall had proclaimed that the HBC was no longer in control of Rupert's Land and that he was the new lieutenant governor. The proclamation was to later prove problematic, as it effectively ended the authority of the council, but failed to establish Canadian authority. McDougall did not know that the transfer had been postponed once news of the unrest had reached Ottawa. Around mid-December 1869, Riel presented the convention with a list of 14 rights as a condition of union, They included representation in Parliament, a bilingual legislature and Chief Justice, and recognition of certain land claims. The land claim part was a continuation of the misinformation, of the gossip, created by the simple land surveys that sparked the problem. No one was going to lose land. The parcels were simply being measured. The convention did not adopt the list at the time, but once the list of right was generally known, most Anglophones accepted the majority of demands as reasonable. Much of the settlement was moving toward the Métis point of view, as it was increasingly dangerous to do otherwise. But there was a passionately pro-Canadian minority that became more resistant. It was loosely organized as the Canadian Party and was led by Dr. John Christian Schultz and Charles Mayer. Colonel Dennis and Major Charles Bolton also supported it. MacDougall appointed Dennis to raise a militia to arrest the Métis, who were occupying Upper Fort Garry. The Anglophone settlers largely ignored the call to arms, and Dennis withdrew to Lower Fort Garry. Schultz, however, was emboldened to fortify his house and his store, and attracted around 50 recruits. Riel took the threat seriously and ordered for Schultz's home to be surrounded. The resistors surrendered on December 7th and were imprisoned in Fort Garry. Provisional government. The unrest and the absence of a clear authority made the Métis National Committee declare a provisional government on December 8th, having received notification of the delay in the Union until the British government of the HBC could guarantee a peaceful transfer. MacDougall and Dennis departed for Ontario on December 18th. Major Bolton fled to Portage-la-Prairie. In Ottawa, Governor-General Lord Lisgar had, at the behest of Prime Minister John A. MacDonald, proclaimed an amnesty on December 6th for all in the Red River area who would lay down their arms. He dispatched Abbé Jean-Baptiste Thibault and Charles René de Urumberry de Salaberry on a mission of reconciliation, but failed to give them the authority to negotiate on behalf of the government. MacDonald appointed the HBC representative, Donald Alexander Smith, as a special commissioner with greater authority to negotiate. On December 27th, John Bruce resigned as president of the provisional government, and Riel was elected president. The same day, Donald Smith arrived in the settlement, followed shortly by de Salaberry, who joined Thibault, who had arrived on Christmas Day. They met with Riel on January 5th, 1870, but reached no conclusions. The next day, Riel and Smith had another meeting. Smith then concluded that negotiation with the committee would be fruitless. He maneuvered to bypass it and present the Canadian position at a public meeting. Meetings were held on January 19th and January 20th, with Riel acting as translator. Smith assured the large audiences of the Canadian government's goodwill, intention to grant representation, and willingness to extend concessions with respect to land claims. With the settlement now solidly behind him, Riel proposed the formation of a new convention of 40 representatives, divided evenly between French and English-speaking settlers, to consider Smith's instructions, which was accepted. A committee of 6 outlined a more comprehensive list of rights, which the convention accepted on February 3rd. After meetings on February 7th, in which the new list of rights were presented to Thibault, Salaberry, and Smith, Smith proposed for a delegation to be sent to Ottawa to engage in direct negotiations with Canada, a suggestion that was eagerly accepted by Riel. Riel also proposed for the provisional government to be reformed to be more inclusive of both language groups. A constitution enshrining those goals was accepted by the convention on February 10th. An elected assembly was established, consisting of 12 representatives from Anglophone parishes and an equal number of representatives from Francophone parishes. Canadian resistance and execution of Thomas Scott. Despite the progress on the political front and the inclusion of Anglophones within the provisional government, the Canadian contingent was not yet silenced. On January 9th, many prisoners escaped from the prison at Fort Garry, including Charles Mayer, Thomas Scott, and 10 others. John Schultz escaped on January 23rd. By February 15th, Riel had freed the remaining prisoners on parole to refrain from engaging in political agitation. Schultz, Mayer, and Scott intended to continue to work to depose the Métis from power and help establish the legal Canadian provincial government. Mayer and Scott proceeded to the loyal Canadian settlements surrounding Portage-la-Prairie, where they met Bolton. And Schultz sought recruits in the Canadian parishes downstream. On February 12th, Bolton led a party from Portage-la-Prairie to rendezvous at Kildonan with Schultz's men. They intended to overthrow the provisional government. Bolton had misgivings and turned the party back. Riel's forces detected the men, and on February 17th, Bolton, Scott, and 46 other men were captured near Fort Garry. On hearing the news, Schultz and Mayer fled to Ontario. Riel demanded for an example to be made of Bolton. He was tried and sentenced to death for his interference with the provisional government. Intercessions on his behalf by Donald Smith and others resulted in his pardon, but only after Riel had obtained assurances from Smith that he would persuade the English parishes to elect provisional representatives. However, the prisoner Thomas Scott, an Orangeman, interpreted Bolton's pardon as weakness on the part of the Métis, whom he regarded with open contempt. He had every right to do this, as Riel's government was in rebellion against the legal government of Canada. After he repeatedly quarreled with his guards, they insisted for him to be tried for insubordination. At his trial, which was overseen by Ambroise Diadem Lepine, he was found guilty of insulting the president, defying authority of the provisional government, and fighting with his guards. Again, insulting people in a free society isn't a crime, nor not recognizing a rebel government or resisting the guards appointed by the rebel government. He was sentenced to death, although the counts were not then considered capital crimes. They still are not in free societies. Smith and Bolton asked Riel to commute the sentence, but Smith reported that Riel responded to his pleas by saying, "I have done 3 good things since I have commenced. I have spared Bolton's life at your insistence. I pardoned Gaddy, and now I shall shoot Scott." Scott was executed by a firing squad on March 4th, 1870. Here is an artist's depiction of the execution of Scott, 1870. Historians have debated Riel's motivations for allowing the execution, as they have considered it one great political blunder. His own justification was that he felt it necessary to demonstrate to the Canadians that the Métis must be taken seriously. Riel was not a judge, nor was he even a lawyer, and had no legal authority to pass this judgment and have Scott executed, nor force anyone else to pass the judgment. Riel had committed murder. Creation of Manitoba. Upon receiving news of the unrest, Bishop Taché was recalled from Rome. He arrived back in the colony on March 8th, and he conveyed to Riel his mistaken impression that the December amnesty would apply to both Riel and Lépine. On March 15th, he read to the elected assembly a telegram from Joseph Howe, indicating that the Canadian government found the demands of the list of rights to be, in the main, satisfactory. After the preparation of a final list of rights, which included new demands such as a general amnesty for all members of the provisional government and provisions for separate francophone schools, the delegates Abbé Joseph Noel Richaud, Judge John Black, and Alfred Henry Scott departed for Ottawa on March 23rd and 24th. Shortly afterward, Mayer and Schultz arrived in Toronto, Ontario. Assisted by George Taylor Denison III, they immediately set about inflaming anti-Métis and anti-Catholic sentiment in the editorial pages of the Ontario Press over the execution of Scott. However, Prime Minister MacDonald had decided before the provisional government was established that Canada must negotiate with the Métis. Although the delegates were arrested after their arrival in Ottawa on April 11th on charges of abetting murder, they were quickly released. They soon entered into direct talks with MacDonald and George Etienne Cartier, and Richaud emerged as an effective negotiator. An agreement enshrining many of the demands in the list of rights was soon reached. That formed the basis of the Manitoba Act of May 12, 1870, which admitted Manitoba to the Canadian Confederation on July 15th. Here is a map of Canada after the creation of Manitoba by the Manitoba Act of 1870. The government had to deal with several issues before peace could be made. Fortunately for the government, an agreement was reached. With the creation of Manitoba, the Canadian government would gain control over a new area and not have to worry about the Métis being upset, as they would also be gaining control over the land. On May 12, 1870, the Métis had been given 200,000 hectares of land, which would make up the province of Manitoba. That would allow for the Métis to hunt freely in their land and have some form of government, with legitimate powers to run the province and protect Métis rights. Even though the government had created the Province of Manitoba for the Métis, it also allowed the government to have control over the province without being responsible for any events that occurred in it. Manitoba would be the first province created from the Northwest Territories. Significantly, however, Riel could not secure a clarification of the Governor General's amnesty. There's a warrant for Riel and Lepin's arrest. Anger over Scott's execution was growing rapidly in Ontario, and any such guarantee was not politically expedient. The delegates returned to Manitoba with only a promise of a forthcoming amnesty. The Wolseley expedition. A military expedition had in any case been decided on as a means of exercising Canadian authority in the Red River settlement and dissuading the Minnesota expansionists. It embarked in May under Colonel Garnet Wolseley and made its way up the Great Lakes. Garnet Wolseley, during his career, would feature highly in the Second Anglo-Burmese War, the Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny, Second Opium War, American Civil War as an observer, Fenian raids, Red River Rebellion, Anglo-Ashanti War, Anglo-Zulu War, Second Sequoian War, Anglo-Egyptian War, Anglo-Sudan War, and Second Boer War. He eventually rose up through the ranks to Major General and eventually to command the British Army as a Field Marshal. He is the subject in the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, The Pirates of Penzance, as the character of Major General Stanley. The song is called I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General.
Information that you double line of bullet mineral. I know the kings of England and I got a bunch of story from the matter of melodies. I know the funky chords from the frogs of Aristophanes, and I can hum a few which I've heard the music's dinner for. Dinner for. Whistle on the earth and that girdle of pinafore. Then I can write the Washington and Babylonian uniform and give you every detail of correcting this uniform. It's only never sensible, animal, and mineral. I am the very model of a modern day general. In fact, when I know what is meant by Babylon and rattling, when I can tell its sight how bounds a rifle from a javelin, when such affairs as sorties and surprises I know where he at, and when I know precisely what is meant by commissariat. When I have learned what progress has been made in modern government, when I know what of tactics have enormous in a nunnery, in short, when I've a smattering of elemental strategy. Strategy. You'll say that the Major General is never strategy. My military knowledge, though unlucky and adventuring, has only been brought down to the beginning of the century, but still that is vegetable, animal, and mineral. I am the very model of a modern Major General.
Since the beginning of the Canadian Army, Wolseley Barracks in London, Ontario, has been the home of units of the Royal Canadian Regiment. There is a statue of Wolseley at the Horse Guards Parade in London. He is featured in several history documentaries on the History Chap, created and narrated by the famous British historian Chris Green. He made a particular video about this expedition, which is quite interesting. Ontarians especially believed the Wolseley expedition was intended to suppress the rebellion, but the government described it as an errand of peace. Knowing that he would be arrested and charged with criminal acts, and believing that members of the Canadian militia in the expedition meant to lynch him, Riel and his followers fled hurriedly when the troops arrived unexpectedly at Fort Garry on August 24th, during pouring rain. The arrival of the expedition at Fort Garry marked the effective end of the Red River Rebellion, also known as the Riel Rebellion. Here is more detail of the Wolseley expedition. The first clash of the Red River Rebellion was when the government land surveyors started doing their work at the Red River settlement, and a group of Métis soldiers obstructed them, forcing them from the settlement. Following this clash, Riel prevented the new governor, William McDougall, from entering Rupert's Land, and took over Upper Fort Garry, and established a provisional government. This was open rebellion. Prime Minister John A. MacDonald proposed in 1869 that a force of police officer troops be sent to Manitoba to control the Métis in the area. He wished to model the police force after the Royal Irish Constabulary, with not only riflemen, but also a mounted force. However, this motion was not acted upon, and was later reorganized into the military expedition under Garnet Wolseley. In January and February 1870, Riel led a series of failed negotiations with the federal government and the HBC. On March 4th, 1870, Riel executed Thomas Scott, a loyal supporter of the Canadian government. There are various reasons given for his execution, including considering it an attempt to compel the Canadians into real negotiations. But it was mostly because Riel just didn't like him. There were other reasons for his execution, but it was clearly because of Scott's outspokenness in his opinion of the Métis and needs of prisoners, which angered Riel. Under the leadership of Colonel Garnet Wolseley, the expedition set out in May 1870 from Toronto's new Fort York in an attempt to interdict Riel. Previously, British and Canadian officials such as MacDougall had been permitted to enter the Western Territories of British North America through the United States. However, the U.S. government steadfastly refused to grant permission for British or Canadian troops to cross U.S. soil. It was widely thought to be impossible to move a military force into Western Canada via an all-Canadian route. The Dawson Road was just mapped out 3 years earlier, and the railway was still many years away. The Dawson Road was named after its original architect, Simon James Dawson, who was given the contract to construct a road large enough for the passage of wagon-laden horses that stretched from the shores of Lake Superior to the navigable waters of the interior. Dawson was tasked with having the road passable by May 1st. This was when the expedition was due to arrive at that stage of the journey. However, due to unfavorable weather in the form of rain and a series of forest fires prior to the rainfall, the road was not completed on time. Wolseley ordered a work party consisting of soldiers to aid in the road construction. After working from May 25th until midway through July, Wolseley cut a path from the road to the Winnipeg River. Wolseley and his flotilla were lost for several days before finally finding their portage. Wolseley sent Indian paddlers back to the other flotillas to assist in their journey across the lake. The difficulties were overcome, and the force arrived in Winnipeg in August. Here is a cairn in Sault Ste. Marie commemorating the Wolseley expedition's portage around the St. Mary's Rapids. The expedition traveled to Georgian Bay at the beginning of the trip. Then it went by steamer across Lake Huron to the U.S. Sioux Canal, where men and material had to be transported on the Canadian side of the river. The two steamers hired by the Canadian government were the Algoma and the Chicora. This is the Sioux Rapids in 1870. The St. Mary's Canal went through the territory of the United States, critical to moving supplies northward. The first steamer, the Algoma, made it through before the Chicora was stopped. American border agents stopped the steamers due to the movement of soldiers and materials of war, which were viewed as a threat. The U.S. authorities forced Wolseley to unload the Chicora of all soldiers and materials of war prior to letting it pass. Wolseley then arranged the 4.3-kilometer portage of the soldiers and materials upriver on the Canadian side of the river to be loaded back onto the awaiting Algoma. The expedition then proceeded across Lake Superior to the Department of Public Works station at Thunder Bay, which Wolseley named Prince Arthur's Landing on May 25th in honor of Queen Victoria's third son. From there, the troops carried small boats to Lake Shibandawan. On August 3rd, the 1st Brigade of canoes started their journey towards Fort Garry, leaving from the shores of Shibandawan. The brigades followed the original HBC trapping line until they reached Kashabowie Lake, when they began to follow a new route, which Dawson had found and constructed. Traveling further westwards, they passed through Fort Francis. Arriving on August 4th, Wolseley made it to Lake of the Woods. However, he lost his way. On August 15th, he finally made Rat Portage with his flotilla and sent Iroquois guides back to help the remaining brigades cross the river. They proceeded down the Winnipeg River and across the south basin of Lake Winnipeg to the Red River, finally arriving at Fort Garry in late August. Wolseley formed up his troops and immediately began his advance on Upper Fort Garry. According to first-hand accounts of the troops searching or marching on the fort, the southern gate stood thrown open, and the fort was abandoned. Fort Garry was officially reported as being taken back into the Canadian government's control as of August 24th, with a ceremonial raising of the Union Jack. Louis Riel and his followers abandoned Fort Garry, resulting in a bloodless victory for Wolseley. The lack of resistance to the Wolseley expedition had been attributed to both the remoteness of the location and the federal government's efforts to avoid provoking the local inhabitants into no further rebellion. An eyewitness account of the expedition's arrival at Upper Fort Garry, provided by a member of the expedition, William Perrin, appeared in the Manitoba Free Press in August 1900, on the 30th anniversary of the arrival. Perrin was a regular British soldier of the 60th, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, Regiment of Foot. The expedition is considered by military historians to have been among the most arduous in history. Over 1,000 men had to transport all their provisions and weaponry, including cannons, over hundreds of miles of wilderness. At numerous portages, corduroy roads had to be constructed. As these jobs were being done, the troops had to endure life in the bush for over 2 months, in summer heat and the inevitable plagues of black flies and mosquitoes. While Wolseley was able to maintain strict military discipline among the British regulars under his command, the militiamen wanted to avenge the execution of Thomas Scott. Moreover, the British soldiers promptly returned to Ontario, leaving the militia to garrison the community. Militia harassment of Métis made intense feelings a bit worse, and at least one death resulted. Imperial and Canadian military forces in the Red River Rebellion. Imperial military forces. The 1st Battalion, 60th, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, Regiment of Foot. This was 26 officers and 350 men. Detachment of Royal Artillery. This was 1 officer and 19 soldiers, with 4 7-pounder brass mountain guns. Detachment of Royal Engineers. This was 1 officer and 19 engineers. They were mainly working with the building of the Dawson Road. Detachment of the Army Service Corps. This was kitchen services, food, and other supplies. And detachment of Army Hospital Corps. Canadian Militia. The 1st Ontario Rifles. This was 28 officers and 350 soldiers, all volunteers. This unit has no direct connection to any existing Canadian Army unit today. The 2nd Quebec Rifles. This was 28 officers and 350 soldiers, mostly English-speaking. This unit was mostly English-speaking. The battalion also had no direct connections to existing Canadian Army units today. Transportation personnel. This was 400 Aboriginal voyageurs hired to handle the canoes. The 100 Iroquois voyageurs from the Montreal area were said to be the most reliable and best equipped to handle rapid moving water. There were also 150 horses and 100 teamsters hired to handle the horses and wagons. The Northwest Mounted Police was established 3 years later, in 1873, so they did not take part in the expedition. Following the successful completion of the expedition, Wolseley penned a tribute to his men in recognition of their extraordinary efforts. The expedition's inability to sail through the Sioux locks on the Michigan side of the river led to a federal government effort to build a water passageway on the Ontario side. This resulted in construction of the Sault Ste. Marie Canal, completed in 1895. That canal is now used for recreational boating and as a part of the National Park System, and is a National Historic Site managed by Parks Canada. The Red River Expedition of 1870 was named a National Historic Event on January 12, 2018. The street next to the site of Wolseley's Landing in the city of Thunder Bay is named Wolseley Street. Aftermath of the Riel Rebellion. The Red River Crisis was described as a rebellion only after sentiment grew in Ontario against the execution of Thomas Scott. The historian A.G. Maurice suggests that the phrase Red River Rebellion owes its persistence to alliteration, a quality that made it attractive for publication in newspaper headlines. The episode has been described as a resistance rather than a rebellion by some scholars, as it was resisting against an expanding authority rather than rebelling against an established government. This is absurd and makes no sense whatsoever, as Riel and his followers were clearly in rebellion against the legal government. Liscar's vice-regal successor, the Earl of Dufferin, prevented the execution of Ambroise Diadem Lepine, who had sentenced Scott to death. Although Scott had been the son of a tenant on Dufferin's estate in Northern Ireland, Dufferin heeded appeals from francophones in Quebec who were sympathetic to the Métis and reduced Lepine's sentence to 2 years in jail. Following the suppression of the rebellion, soldiers of the 1st Ontario Battalion of Rifles, stationed in Upper Fort Garry, assaulted many Métis found around the fort, whether they had participated in the rebellion or not. John Bruce and Laurent Garneau, later a pioneer of Edmonton, left Red River in part due to this situation. In 1875, Riel was formally exiled from Canada for 5 years. Under pressure from Quebec, the government of Sir John A. MacDonald took no more vigorous action. Riel was elected to the Canadian Parliament 3 times in exile, but never took his seat. He returned to Canada in 1885 to lead the ill-fated Northwest Rebellion. He was then tried and convicted for high treason and executed by hanging. In popular culture, Canadian folk singer and writer James Keelahan wrote a song, Red River Rising, about the Red River Rebellion. Francis Concan's 2020 play, Women of the Fur Trade, was set in a fort in Red River and features 3 women discussing the events around them. Also, remember to check out the History Chat and find the documentary about the Red River Expedition.